This is a video about my own unconventional views on human rights. I'm someone who has a formal university degree in political science, and my second university degree is in Asian studies, but it's again very much about politics, dealing with the politics of Asia, including what you could call human rights issues in the history of China, Cambodia, and elsewhere. You can read many of my essays online. In the past, also, I was a student of First Nations languages at First Nations University of Canada. I studied Cree, Ojibwe, etc. And obviously, many political questions connected to Indigenous peoples in Canada are expressed in terms of human rights discourse. So you could say I have a long career, both of studies and of actual work, humanitarian work and political engagement, linked to human rights. And to some extent, the questions of the future of the vegan movement explored on this YouTube channel also are linked to human rights questions, if only by way of providing a contrast from time to time. This topic comes up now because I just had some very intelligent email from Ask Yourself. Ask Yourself is the name he uses. He's another vegan YouTuber. And I was really surprised, and this is a very intelligent email, and it makes me kind of change my opinion of the guy. Very often in our interactions with other vegans online, we're only judging them on the basis of a couple of emails either way. So when people send me email I think is unintelligent, it makes me think they're not very bright. And when they send me email that's intelligent, I change my opinion of them accordingly. But anyway, I got an intelligent email from this guy, Ask Yourself, and it does touch on this issue of my repudiation of human rights, my saying kind of dismissive and negative things about human rights discourse as such, and my offering a pretty harsh critique of how some vegans just want to extend the human rights discourse to include animals. They think that's the simple way to define and address and proceed with animal rights vegan discourse. Now, I can't quite say I'm an opponent of human rights, but I made the following laconic remark in my reply to Ask Yourself. I said, look, human rights discourse is like a baseball cap. Human beings wear this cap so they can tell which team they're on. Human rights. Some countries really put on that baseball cap, and in international politics and geopolitics and negotiations, they really claim strongly to be representing human rights. Well, does Japan within Asia? Does India? These are gray areas. These are questions that come and go, that change from year to year and month to month. The United States and some countries in Western Europe really wear that baseball cap and represent that team. How does Saudi Arabia fit into that picture? In Saudi Arabia, it's still actively debated whether or not women should have the right to drive a car. How does North Korea fit in that picture? So it's very clear in terms of real-world politics that, as I say, to some extent, human rights is just like a baseball cap that human beings wear so they can tell which team they're on, cynically or not. And then I raised the question, does it really accomplish anything if human beings take off this baseball cap and put it on the head of a dog? If we try to extend this mentality, this human rights discourse, so that it includes animals, or includes some animals, right? We're putting the hat on a dog. Are we putting the hat on a cockroach? Are we putting it on a bear in the wild, on untamed animals? So this was my kind of half-joking, half-serious way of indicating, my own cynicism, my own doubts, both about human rights discourse, the utility of it to start with, and then how we can extend it to animals. There is one level on which I think human rights is a completely non-problematic legal set of terms that we can use rationally with no difficulty at all. In England, the last time I was in England anyway, I don't think this has changed. In England, you have the right to drink whiskey in a public park. You have the right to drink alcohol. And in Canada, you do not. Now, if that is a human right, or if that is a civil right, however you prefer to phrase it, that means that a poor homeless person with a beard has the right to sit there and drink whiskey out of a paper bag in a public park. And young, wealthy people can spread out a picnic blanket and have a bottle of champagne. Either this is a human right or it's not. Either it applies to everyone equally or it doesn't. And of course, if you live in England for a while, which I have at a few different times in my life, one time when I was in England, this came up on radio, on call-in radio, and once I saw it coming up in the letters to the editor of a newspaper. What you often find is that this is the exact opposite of what the public wants. What the public wants is to take away the right to drink alcohol from homeless men with beards, or men who just might look like they're homeless sitting in the park with their bag of whiskey, and nevertheless to retain that right for live concerts. Maybe there's a rock concert selling beer or alcohol, or for wealthy young people who spread out a picnic blanket and are well-dressed and drink champagne while they're in the park, right? So this is one level on which human rights discourse, I think, unfolds absolutely no problem. It's much easier for me to talk about this and what my own position is on human rights today than it was when I was, say, 22, 23 years old. I can remember struggling to articulate what my position was. And the reason is this. In politics, there's a difference between the problem itself, the problem with a particular organization, the problem with a particular concept, and the problem of public perception being perhaps very poorly matched to the reality of what it is we're discussing. Now, I'm sorry, that's somewhat awkward phrasing. I don't know any, cute way to, put a bow on that. But the distinction I'm talking about here, we can use the Catholic Church as an example. The distinction here is between criticizing the Catholic Church for what it's actually done wrong, perhaps crimes against humanity, perhaps human rights violations. For example, in the Canadian context, I may complain about the Catholic Church and their role in genocide, in the destruction of native peoples, cultures, languages, etc. I may complain about specific doctrines the Catholic Church teaches. I don't actually believe in prayer. I think that when you pray, you're talking to yourself, and you're just pretending to talk to your imaginary friend who created the universe. So, there are various ways in which I can criticize the thing itself. But a lot of our time and energy in politics is not invested in dealing with those problems, the problem thing itself. They're instead dealing with the gap between public perception of the problem and what the problem really is. You may be living in a country, or just in a social context, your own community, your own circle of friends. You may be living in a context where you're surrounded by people who really sincerely believe in Catholicism, who really sincerely believe in the excuses that the Catholic Church makes for itself, whether in reference to what Columbus did in 1492, the crimes of genocide and colonialism in the past, or much more recent crimes from the 1950s to present within Canada. The Catholic Church has true believers, and you can be living in a situation where what you're really wrestling with is not the church, not what the church has done, not church policy, not church doctrine, not their actions or decisions, but you're struggling with the gap between public perception of what the church ought to be, what they want the church to be, and what it really is. And a very large part of what I felt so frustrated with when I was, say, 22, 23 years old, was that I was surrounded by people who really wanted to believe in the United Nations, who really wanted to believe in the concept of war for peace, who really wanted to believe that human rights was a panacea. And I just paused to note, the word panacea is horribly overused in English language newspapers today, but in this case it is apt, I feel I have to say it. A lot of people around me wanted to believe in human rights as a panacea. They wanted to believe in human rights as something that would solve all of the political problems in Cambodia. If only Cambodia had human rights. Human rights is something that justified the United States military intervention in, say, Yugoslavia, and yet at the same time it seemed to justify the lack of any United States intervention in many other theaters of war. I mean, again, like wearing the baseball cap, I saw human rights being used cynically to, justify atrocities that were being committed by American allies, and of course to exaggerate or vilify atrocities that may be better or may be worse in some other country that happens to be, an American opponent, or a country where the United States is willing to criticize them or willing to even carry out military intervention or other punitive actions, trade sanctions, and what have you. I like to do these videos in one take with no script because it has a sort of lively, spontaneous quality to it that otherwise might be lacking if this were a dry academic discussion, reading out paragraphs from an essay or that sort of thing. And you can tell this video was a spontaneous response to a conversation I had by email, so it has that lively feeling to it. But it's really interesting for me to watch that first take of this video. I just watched it now, and now I'm adding in this addendum because I think I completely failed to deliver the message of this video. And I failed to deliver it because I was avoiding the B word. I didn't want to make this video into a statement on whether or not I believe in human rights. But actually the core issue here really is about belief versus empiricism, Or I could say belief versus nihilism. I came up in political science, studying politics, let's just say being a person who cares about politics, even before I was in university and after I had the university education. I came up in politics surrounded by people who would, consciously or unconsciously, think of human rights as an ideal that justified various actions, aspirations, interventions, decisions in politics. They wouldn't even think of it in terms of outcomes. They really did think of it as a kind of quasi-religious concept. Now, by contrast, when I talked to these people, it was very, very hard for me to communicate with them because I'd ask a question like, well, have you actually studied what happened with the United Nations intervention in Cambodia? And they hadn't. But there was this sense like, okay, well, the United Nations intervened in Cambodia and created human rights where there were no human rights before. Therefore, it's a wonderful thing. And the empirical attitude is to start off studying Cambodia as a case study, or studying Yugoslavia as a case study, or studying any other intervention on behalf of human rights, any other action on behalf of human rights, not with the assumption that we already know what human rights is and what it means, but where you look at empirically what happened in Cambodia, step by step, stage by stage. You look at the motivations of the different actors involved, and you look at the outcomes, intended and unintended consequences. And then you step back from that picture once you've got a good understanding of it. Maybe just one case study like Cambodia, maybe a half dozen case studies. Cambodia, East Timor, Yugoslavia, take your pick, all over the world. And then you step back and say, okay, that's human rights. That's the reality of what this is. Okay? The United Nations taking over Cambodia, writing its laws for it, the United Nations providing an interim dictatorship government in Cambodia. This is the reality of what we mean when we talk about human rights. The reality of the United Nations setting up a series of short-term governments in former Yugoslavia, so-called Troika government and so on and so forth, one after another. Bizarre history of the government of Iraq, even, after the United States intervention in Iraq. This is what, in practice, human rights means. I've said before that I'm not just a nihilist, but identify with the term historical nihilism. I describe myself as an historical nihilist. And part of that is, I could say, a willingness to let history teach you what things really mean. What is communism? There's a real sense in which you could never learn that by reading Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. There are some ways in which you can't. It helps. It's certainly part of the study. It's part of answering what is communism, you will find by reading ideological works like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. But then look at what actually happened when Lenin had to run for government in elections. What happened when communists had elections? And what happened afterward when Lenin hunted down and killed the elected representatives in parliament so that he could take over and rule by a dictatorship? Because he didn't get, from his perspective, he didn't get enough votes. Right? What actually happened under Lenin and Stalin and Mao Zedong? Not just on an executive level, not just on an economic level, and maybe not just on the level of the peasant experience, let's say. On all those levels, if you just, in a careful and concerned way, let history show you what communism means, I think communism becomes impossible to believe in. And as a general rule, as a nihilist, I think that all things become impossible to believe in. What's better than belief is living with a certain kind of rigor, doubt, and insight, and an openness into still learning that you're wrong, even when you think you've got a pretty solid grip on the situation and what the concepts mean. So that is really the contrast that I failed to get across in that first take of this video, is the contrast between someone who has this concept of human rights that they believe in, and they then apply it to Cambodia, or they apply it to Russia, or they apply it to Yugoslavia, whatever the case may be, or Iraq, still ongoing. And someone who sits back and says, okay, wait, maybe I don't really know what you mean by human rights. maybe I don't really know what the United States government means by human rights, what the State Department or the Office of the President means by human rights. I'm going to sit back and I'm going to look at this case study and I'm going to learn from the reality of history. I'm going to learn what human rights really meant in the history of Yugoslavia, Cambodia, Russia, China, Iraq, what have you. And then I'm going to draw my conclusions on this concept, on this ideology, what its enforcement really entails in terms of both intended and unintended consequences. There is a sense in which you can say Lenin never intended for people to starve to death. He wasn't a pro-starvation ideology. But nevertheless, when you really understand communism as a concept, you know that putting it into practice leads to starvation, that there is a cause and effect relationship between the economic reforms Lenin made, between decisions he made, and the starvation of huge numbers of people. So when you grow up in that context, I really think that when I was a younger man, I had a kind of animus against the human rights discourse because I'd seen it so misused, both cynically misused and misused in this sense of true believers exaggerating the virtues, exaggerating the concept of what human rights really are. Rights discourse, if we can keep it sane and we can keep it down to earth, if we can keep it in the same kind of clear, limited legal framework with which we discuss whether or not people have the right to drink alcohol in a park, whether or not women have the right to drive a car. Still a struggle in Saudi Arabia. It's possible I'm on a date. Every time I check the news in Saudi Arabia, that seems to be pretty close to the top of the news headlines. Still debating whether or not women should have the right to drive a car. And as you can imagine, people visit Saudi Arabia from other Muslim majority countries that may be very strictly Muslim, but where women have those rights. So those are questions within the rights discourse that go on, and where rights discourse seems to me well enough suited to address them. However, I also come from a country, Canada, that kind of waved the flag for human rights, basically since the end of World War II. And yet, from my perspective, some of the worst atrocities for us as a nation that we're responsible for happened after World War II. They happened on our watch. During my parents' lifetime, this is not ancient history. They were carried out against First Nations at the same time that we were preaching human rights to other countries and reproaching other countries for the lack of human rights. So, the hollowness of that discourse, the extent to which that discourse is a failure, and as I say, just having grown up around people who had expectations of the United Nations, the concept of peacekeeping itself, of war for peace, concepts of human rights and international governance and how this would change the world and solve all our problems fundamentally. Really, panacea-like beliefs in human rights. It's in that context that have ended up having such a nihilistic view of what human rights are, what they aren't, basically what questions they pose for us, and how rarely it is that human rights offers us any answers.